Hello and welcome to a new episode of Nile TV Newsroom Live. I'm Raham Morsi, and if you're watching the show for the very first time, let me reintroduce you to what the show is all about. The show is composed of a number of different segments. Firstly, we take a look at what's happening in the world of politics. Next comes business and finance, in addition to learning more about what's happening in the world of technology sometimes, in addition to cultural and arts events, as well as sports. Today we are starting off the episode a little later than usual because of Ramadan timing, but stay tuned for the rest of the holy month of Ramadan at the same time here at 11 p.m. Cairo local time. We're going to take a short break and move on with the first segment, which is politics. Starting off with Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers having vowed to meet before the end of the holy month of Ramadan to implement a landmark reconciliation deal. The two countries said Monday. The official Saudi press agency reported that Saudi Prince Faisal bin Farhan and his Iranian counterpart Hussein Amir Abdullah held their second phone call in less than a week and discussed a number of common issues in light of the surprise agreement brokered by China, announced on March 10th. Iran's foreign ministry said the two men discussed the latest status of the agreement between the two countries and talked about a joint meeting in the holy month of Ramadan as a setup for the opening of embassies for both countries. Joining us over the phone to tell us more about the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is Dr. Sharif Amir, a professor of international relations. Good evening to you, sir, and happy Ramadan.
Good evening to you.
Sir, can you tell us a bit about the pace of how they're normalizing relations, Iran and Saudi Arabia? It seems to be going quite fast.
Well, we all know that the Chinese government initiated this mediation. It doesn't go that fast. If not, it was done in secret long ago. So I think that, of course, President Xi Jinping himself was a mediator in this negotiations.
Yes.
We know that the Saudis expressed openly several times their worries about the nuclear armament program in Iran, their intervention in Yemen, their intervention in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and Bahrain, and
Yes.
they threatened the Emirates. So I think that it was a huge concern, and we all know that their diplomatic relations were cut.
Yes.
But let me say that now the situation is changing dramatically on the international arena. We have the collapse of the American monopoly in front of our eyes.
Yes.
The United States always counted on the Iranian threat to the Gulf, so it would be always present in the
Yes.
Gulf states. And I think that the Russians and the Chinese understood that this was the only way to cut the American monopoly,
Yes.
is to give assurances to Saudi Arabia that Iran would not harm you. Iran is under control of its weapons. And I think that if any other country was a mediator rather than China, I think that the Saudis would not have accepted it. But now that the Chinese are the sponsors, I think that it has a huge credibility.
Sir, this question is a two-parter. Do you believe, sir, that the American influence here in the Middle East with this new deal that was brokered by China could be diminished somehow by what's happening with Iran and Saudi Arabia? And the second part of the question is, do you believe that this will also affect stability within the region, specifically when it comes to Israel? Because Israel has always had a fear from Iran.
Well, the first question, the first part, of course, the United States now especially, let's be precise, the Biden administration is not really capable of maintaining any of the American power anymore around the world, whether in the Middle East, whether in Africa, whether in the only hub they still have authority on is Europe and NATO. Otherwise, the States, the American influence is diminishing. So, of course, it's a sign that the Gulf states are not anymore listening to the threats of the American administration telling them that Iranians would one day invade you. Yes. The second part of the question, it was about, of course, we all know that Israel
is a strong ally with America's.
Exactly. Israel, and especially Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, always advocated the fact that he's the one who would stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And he wouldn't take in any steps, military steps, except by the American green light.
Yes.
So I think that the Israeli Prime Minister now, facing what we are seeing now, this historic confrontation in Israel, I think that Israel now is not really interested in the case of Iran, which is also another problem for the United States, because Israel has its internal problems now, and the last thing they want to talk about now is Iran.
Yes, sir, could we take this on a more global scale? Regionally, we understand that this will cause a little bit of instability and stability in certain areas when it comes to the Middle East. But on a global scale, do you believe that the influence of America being an exclusive superpower is now not true anymore? We're going back to the Cold War era, where Russia and China and its allies are somehow also superpowers who are opposing ideologies and directions from the United States.
Well, the situation is getting more and more complicated because of the American attitude internationally. I think that the Americans understand that their power is diminishing, and it's diminishing very, very quickly. The question of the special military operation, the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, went successful for Russia. It made Russia more and more powerful. The sanctions didn't bring any harm to Russia, except it brought severe consequences for the West European countries like France, Germany, and they are paying the price. So I think that even the allies of the United States are paying the price for following Washington. I know that the Biden administration is divided. They have some asking that they should not supply any more Ukraine with the armament. Ukraine is losing, and Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, pledged more arms, but he doesn't have the capability of waging a war against Russia. So I think the Chinese and Russian coalition now, which is very calm, very peaceful until now, is showing the Americans that things are changing now. It's not even the Cold War, it's the multipolar map.
Yes.
And Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, he said we aim to create a multipolar world. For instance, and he gave an example in the Middle East, countries like Turkey and Egypt and Israel. He said Egypt and Turkey are both important pillars, so that's what we need in every region, several regional powers.
Okay, Dr. Sharif Amir, a professor of international relations, thank you so much for joining us over the phone. We're going to take a short break and move on with the rest of the episode. A Palestinian youth died of his wounds on Tuesday after sustaining injuries by Israeli occupation troops fire. during a raid last month in the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. The city was rocked by Israeli army and soldier violence in February. Since the start of this year, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has claimed the lives of over 86 Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paused a judicial overhaul that triggered a general strike, political division and mass protests in the country's most severe domestic crisis in years. After nearly 3 months of increasing tensions, the legislation will now be considered further in the next session of Parliament, which begins in the second half of April. Here's the story.
Caution prevailed on Tuesday after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to pause controversial judicial reforms, which sparked a general strike and mass protests, with the crisis far from over. Netanyahu bowed to pressure in the face of a nationwide walkout on Monday, which hit hospitals, flights and more, while tens of thousands of reform opponents rallied outside Parliament. The decision to hold the legislative process marked a dramatic U-turn for the premier, who just a day earlier announced he was sacking his defense minister, who had called for the very same step. The move was greeted with skepticism, with leading daily newspaper Yediot Aharonot commenting the premier knew how to transform a crushing defeat with pretty words into a draw. Opposition leader Yair Lapid reacted warily, saying he wanted to be sure that there is no ruse or bluff. The opposition had previously refused to negotiate over the reforms, which would hand politicians more power over the judiciary until the legislative process was stopped. Activists who have led nearly 3 months of protests against the reform package vowed to continue their rallies. The crisis has revealed deep rifts within Netanyahu's fledgling coalition, an alliance with far-right and the ultra-Orthodox parties.
Ukraine's national grid operator imposed emergency electricity shutdowns in 8 Ukrainian regions on Tuesday because of bad weather, and said Russian attacks had affected the power supply in some frontline areas. The shutdowns follow an improvement in electricity supplies across Ukraine in recent weeks, in what officials have hailed as a victory in their battle to restore power after months of Russian missiles and drone strikes. Ukraine's energy system has survived despite months of attacks that have at times left millions of people without electricity, heating or water. Officials say about 40% of the energy system has been damaged, and teams of workers continue repairs to restore power and strengthen the energy system. Weather forecasters expect weather conditions to a further deterioration in the weather this week. France's labor unions appealed to President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday to hit pause on his plans to raise the legal retirement age as a new round of demonstrations and strikes got underway and the authorities deployed thousands of police. Fresh strikes and protests roiled France on Tuesday with a record number of police deployed as President Emmanuel Macron remained defiant over a pension reform that is sparking turmoil in the country. The day of action is the 10th since protests began in mid-January against the law, which includes raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Last Thursday saw the most violent clashes yet between protesters and security forces as tensions erupted into pitched battles on the streets of Paris, and police reported 457 arrests across France and injuries of 441 officers. Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin said 13,000 members of the security forces would be deployed on Tuesday, 5,500 of them in Paris alone. The number, a record, was justified by a major risk to public order. Nearly 2 weeks after Macron rammed the new pension law through Parliament using a special provision sidestepping a vote in the lower house, unions have vowed not to let up in mass protests to get the government to back down. A state visit to France by Britain's King Charles III, which had been due to begin on Sunday, was postponed because of the unrest. Macron on Monday instead met Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, other cabinet ministers and senior lawmakers for crisis talks at the Élysée Palace. In a conciliatory gesture, Borne has scheduled talks over 3 weeks with members of parliament, political parties and local authorities, while still hoping to meet with the union leaders. She is expected to offer worker representatives new measures designed to ease the impact of pension laws targeting physically demanding jobs, conditions for older workers retaining, but early actions were not promising. At least 39 migrants had died after a fire broke out at a migrant facility in the Mexican northern border city of Ciudad Juarez. There were 68 adults from the Central and South America staying at the facility, and 29 of them were also injured in the blaze. The fire, whose origins were under investigation, were extinguished. The fire was one of the deadliest to hit the country in years. A knife-armored attacker killed 2 women on Tuesday at an Islamic center in the Portuguese capital, Lisbon, before being shot and wounded by police authorities. Portugal's Prime Minister António Costa said it was premature to make an interpretation of this criminal act. Armed police wearing bulletproof vests stood outside the entrance of the Ismaili Muslim center located in a landscape park in northern Lisbon. Officers were called to the center just before 11 a.m., where they encountered a man armed with a large knife. And more on violence related to guns and shootings. Investigators seeking clues to the latest bout of mass gun violence in the United States pored over a manifesto. Other writings uncovered after 3 children and 3 adults were shot dead at a Christian school by a 28-year-old former student. Police killed the perpetrator of Monday's shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, identified by authorities as local resident Audrey Elizabeth Hale. When they stormed the Covenant School within minutes of gunfire erupting in the private church-based academy, authorities did not immediately offer a motive for the killings. The Nashville Police Chief John Drake said in an interview that investigators believed Hale harbored some resentment for having to go to that school as a child. Drake did not elaborate. Among various pieces of evidence under examination by police and FBI, conducting an investigation were some writings by the assailant, including a manifesto and a detailed hand-drawn map of the school showing various entry points. The manifesto indicates there was going to be shootings at multiple locations and that the school was just one of them. The Covenant School was singled out for attacks, but the individual victims were targeted at random. Authorities said Drake, armed with 2 assault-style weapons, one of them a rifle, as well as a 9mm pistol, gained entry to the school by shooting through a window of a side door. Surveillance camera video posted online by police on Monday night shows the suspect wearing camouflage pants, a black vest over a white t-shirt, with a red baseball cap on backwards, blasting through glass panes of an outer door after driving up to the building in a car. The footage then shows the assailant stalking through a hallway as alarm lights flash. Monday's violence in Nashville marked the 90th school shooting in the U.S. so far this year. China said Tuesday its new ambassador to North Korea has taken up his post in a sign the North is reopening amid reports it has been suffering heavily from COVID-19 and food shortages. Wang Ye-jun will help in the development of the traditional friendships between the so-called close neighbors sharing mountains and rivers, according to a foreign ministry statement. And China is North Korea's main source of economic aid and political support. But interactions have been disrupted by travel restrictions imposed in an attempt to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The ambassador's posting comes as North Korean state media reported that leader Kim Jong-un urged his nuclear scientists to increase productions of weapons-grade material to make bombs to put on the country's widening range of weapons. The report Tuesday followed a series of missile launches, 7 this month alone, and rising threats to use the weapons against North Korea's enemies. North Korea's weapons tests and U.S.-South Korea military exercises have intensified in recent months, increasing tensions in the region. China's support for both North Korea and Russia is seen as an act of defiance against the U.S.-led liberal world order, along with ensuring security borders along them. While China has agreed to the United Nations sanctions against North Korea over its nuclear tests, it has repeatedly assured the Kim regime of support to prevent its collapse and potential humanitarian, military and political consequences that might ensue. In business and finance, lawmakers are expected to put top U.S. bank regulators on the defensive over the unexpected failures of regional lenders Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank when they testify before Congress on Tuesday. Top regulatory officials for the Federal Reserve, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation (FDIC), and Treasury Department are testifying before congressional committees on the swift collapse of the two banks earlier this month, which set off a broader loss of investor confidence in the banking sector. Regulators have vowed to review their rules and procedures after the twin failures, while insisting the overall system remains sound. Tuesday's hearings at the Senate Banking Committee will give lawmakers the chance to press watchdogs on what went wrong on their watch. The push preferred policy prescriptions. Both said they were reviewing what led to the bank failures and what rules need to be changed to prevent such collapses in the future. The turmoil set off fresh recriminations in Washington as some Democrats and Republicans sharply criticized regulators for allowing the banks to get to such a state. Those funds quickly fled at signs of trouble, according to the Fed Vice Chair for Supervision, Michael Barr, in his prepared testimony. Asian and European markets traded higher on Tuesday as fears of a banking crisis eased thanks to the sale of fallen lender Silicon Valley Bank. News that North Carolina-based First Citizens Bank had agreed to take over SVB boosted European stocks on Wall Street on Monday. The gains were led by banking shares following a rot last week over concerns that the turmoil in the sector could hit other major institutions such as German giant Deutsche Bank. On Monday, the World Bank warned that an anticipated economic slowdown in China is likely to drag the global growth down to its lowest level this century at proposed measures to prevent lost decade of growth. While markets have responded positively to the measures implemented by authorities to shore up the banking sector, there are still concerns about the impact of ongoing rate hikes by central banks, specifically the U.S. Federal Reserve. Despite the recent turmoil, central banks have pushed on with monetary tightening as they focus on fighting inflation. Welcome back, and joining us over the phone to tell us about the banks in America and the financial consequences of this is Dr. Mohammed Rushdi, a financial analyst. Good evening to you, sir.
Hello, good evening for you and our audience, and Ramadan Kareem for all of us.
Thank you so much, Ramadan Kareem to you and your family as well, sir. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening when it comes to the banking crisis and its effects, not only on the U.S., it's clearly affecting banking services across the world?
Actually, markets have experienced massive upheaval in the last month, promoted in part by two or three largest banking failures in U.S. history, while Swiss lender Credit Suisse was bought by rival UBS Group, actually in a merger engineered by Swiss regulators.
Yes.
I believe fears of banking contagion remain, and investors are worried global economies will suffer if the effects of higher interest rates torpedo more lenders. Actually, there are a lot of things, which is one of them that the biggest financial crisis in the last 40 years. We have a lot of financial crises, starting, as far as I recall, from U.S. saving and loans crisis.
Yes.
It was, as I recall, 1980s, which is over 1,000, as far as I recall, savings and loan institutions were whipped out in the crisis that unfolded throughout the 1980s, resulting in up to, I believe, 124 billion in cost of taxpayer. The upheaval was routed in the unsound real estate and commercial loans made by, after the United States moved the interest rate cap on their loans and deposits.
Yes.
In addition to that junk bond crash, actually it was, as far as I recall, 1980s also, after nearly a decade of subcharged growth, the junk bond market slumped in the late 1980 following a serious interest rate hike by the Federal Reserve.
Yes.
This is in addition to Mexican peso crisis. In a surprise move in December 1994, as far as I recall, Mexico devaluated its currency, the peso, after the country's current account deficit grew and the international reserves declined. The country ended up getting external finance support from IMF, International Monetary Fund, and a $50 billion bailout from the United States. In addition to, after that, Asian currency crisis, which was a massive outflow of capital from Asian economies in the mid to late 1990s, as far as I recall, put pressure on the countries in the region in assisting government support.
Yes.
In addition to long-term capital management, that the highly leveraged U.S. budget found loss more than, as far as I recall, $4 billion in a frame of a few months in 1998, I believe. The fund had a huge exposure to Russian government bonds and took major losses after Russia defaulted on debt and devaluated its currency.
Sir, I mean, can we look at it in a more recent history sort of way? I mean, it seems that the banking sector in general has created many financial crises, like you were saying, around the world. Specifically, if we talk about, for instance, what happened in 2008 and what's happening right now, is related to the fact that there is very little oversight over banking, the banking sector itself, on how they do business. Like the 2008 crisis was related to bad credits and the real estate bubble that was burst because of the bad credit. And now it's also the same idea. Do you believe that the congressional hearings that are going to take place will somehow create some sort of apparatus to have some sort of proper oversight over the banking sector so this doesn't happen again?
Actually, what I'm trying to illustrate that I'm trying to illustrate to our audience the history of the financial crisis globally, and it was a great linking that linked what's happening now to the global financial crisis of 2008, which was one of the biggest financial crises since the Great Depression, was routed in risky loans to shaky borrowers, which started to lose value after central banks raised the interest rate in the period leading up to the crisis. Many companies had taken the biggest position in highly leveraged mortgage bonds, as you know, and our audience, that proliferated in previous years. The crisis actually led to the collapse of some storage Wall Street against, including DS Stevens and Lehman Brothers, both of whom have large position in mortgage securities. Actually, which needed, as far as I recall, to need 180 billion bailout and
Yes.
the U.S. government closed Washington Mutual in what was largest ever failure of U.S. bank. The Great Recession was resulted with the worst economy downturn in 70 years. And nowadays, if we are linking this to what's happening nowadays, which is one of the most important things, actually, as far as I recall, what happened to three banks.
Yes.
As far as I recall, Silicon Valley Bank,
Yes.
in addition to Signature Bank and Credit Suisse. Those are the most crucial and important things.
Yes.
And what's happening nowadays, which is, and our audience, one of the most important things that happened to the global economy, because a lot of depositors are afraid from what's happening. They are not feeling safe for their money, actually. And this is one of the most, I believe in my humble opinion, which is one of the most negative signals for the U.S. and banks globally. But I believe that the U.S. government is focusing to how to overcome this through the regulations and trying to increase the insurance role to give a positive signal to all the depositors.
Okay, Dr. Mohammed Rushdi, financial analyst, thank you so much for joining us over the phone. We're going to take a short break and move on with the rest of the episode. Britain's opposition Labour Party would bring in its own version of Washington's $369 billion Inflation Reduction Act of green subsidies to spur jobs and make the future made in Britain if it came to power, its environment policy chief said Tuesday. Ed Miliband is the latest member of the Labour's top team to set out his vision, part of an increasingly detailed offer to voters before an election expected next year that opinion polls suggest wins Labour. But with the governing Conservative Party's approval ratings ticking up, Labour officials say they are not complacent about victory and are keen to set out their agenda to try to win over undecided voters. Miliband said Labour would provide certainty and partnership for businesses to invest in Britain, try to break down barriers in planning, introduce a new national wealth fund and create Great Britain Energy, a publicly owned energy company. The government is expected to unveil its energy security plan this week after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he was talking to the United States about the IRA, something Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt said was a very real competitive threat. Energy Minister Grant Shapps responded to Miliband by saying the Conservatives have been leading the green industrial revolution globally for the last 10 years. Italy's unveiled a new $5.4 billion package to soften energy costs, according to officials in Italy. And details of the new plan come out today, with the measures worth almost €5 billion to cut costly energy bills paid by families and firms, according to government officials. The office of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni called a press conference at the end of the cabinet meeting scheduled today to discuss the measures. Rome earmarked over €21 billion in 2023 budget to soften the impact of energy costs in the Eurozone's third largest economy in the first quarter of this year. Meloni aims to revamp these measures using part of the funding initially set aside, but not yet spent due to the recent drop in energy prices. The benchmark gas contract in the Dutch TTF hub hovers around €42 per megawatt at present, sharply down from the €73 in the early 2023. The government will extend until June an existing bonus aimed at cutting energy bills paid by low-income households which benefits people from an annual income of up to €15,000. Separate tax bonuses will also help firms. Spending for electricity and gas supplies in the first quarter of 2023 increased by 30% compared to the same period in 2019. A flat fee bonus to compensate gas costs for families will also take effect from October until December. Rome also intends to soften a windfall tax weighing on energy companies that have benefited last year from oil and gas prices. The right-wing administration plans to apply a 50% one-off levy in the parts of corporate income, which is the latest 10% higher than the average reported in 2021. Italy said last November it expected to raise around €2.565 billion for the scheme, but now the Treasury wants to exclude parts of the company's reserves from the income, which is needed to estimate the due tax according to the draft. Still on energy, Russia successfully directed all its crude oil exports affected by Western sanctions over Ukraine to friendly countries, according to Energy Minister Nikolai Sholengov, and on Tuesday, while still a decline in oil and gas output this year. The West imposed wide-ranging sanctions, including an embargo on seaborne Russian oil imports after Moscow sent its armed forces into the Ukraine in February 2022. Sholeganov reiterated that Russian oil and gas production was expected to decline in 2023 as Moscow comes under pressure from Western restrictions and a lack of European buyers. Speaking at the same event, Alexander Duyakov, the CEO of a Russian oil major, Gazprom, said that 2023 would be more difficult than 22 and the pressure from sanctions would grow. Sholeganov said Russia had been working to reroute its oil and oil product exports to Asia, Africa, Latin America and the Middle East from its traditional markets in Europe. India was the biggest buyer of Russia's benchmark grade crude in March. Deliveries to India are set to account for more than 50% of its seaborne exports this month, with China in second place. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak said Russian oil sales in India jumped 22-fold last year, but he did not specify the volume. Novak said energy revenues accounted for 42% of Russia's federal budget in 2022, up from 36% in 2021. He said Russia's energy industry was sustainable despite the challenges of Western sanctions. Still in the energy sector, the energy source that Germans use to heat their homes should be considered a national security issue, Germany's foreign minister said Tuesday, pushing back against government officials who are wary of making a swift shift away from fossil fuels. Getting homeowners in Germany to replace aging oil and gas furnaces with electric heat pumps has become one of several issues that are dividing Chancellor Olaf Scholz's three-party coalition government. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock's environmentalist Green Party favors strict rules that would effectively ban the installation of conventional oil and gas heaters starting next year, arguing that they fuel climate change and cement Germany's dependence on foreign energy imports. The Liberation-Free Democrats and Scholz's Social Democrats worry such a change would anger voters because of installing heat pumps requires a much bigger initial investment, though the operating costs are lower. Speaking at a renewable energy conference in Berlin, Baerbock acknowledged there was a controversial debate within the government, but insisted that every heating in every basement in the country is part of the future security structure. Almost half of the existing home heating systems in Germany use natural gas, much of which came from Russia until supplies were cut off following the Russian incursion into Ukraine. Similar political debates have been accompanied efforts to cut emissions in Germany's transportation sector, which is still dominated by combustion engine vehicles. Talks to bring Germany's political parties back together, including over related issues such as highway construction, dragged on for a third day Tuesday with no immediate end in sight. The unwieldy coalition government forged the late 2021 pledge to accelerate Germany's transformation towards a greener, less bureaucratic economy, but has repeatedly run into roadblocks along the way. China has handed out $240 billion worth of bailout loans to 22 developing countries at risk of default over the past 2 decades, with the trend accelerating in recent years, according to a report. Almost all the funds went to Belt and Road Initiative BRI countries such as Sri Lanka, Pakistan and Turkey, mostly low and middle income nations that have received Chinese loans for infrastructure development, according to the study. Around the world, BRI nations have come under strain as soaring inflation and interest rates compounded by the lingering impact of COVID-19 have hurt their ability to repay debts. The bailouts allow the countries to extend their loans and remain solvent. China says more than 150 countries have signed up to a $1 trillion global infrastructure push unveiled by Xi Jinping a decade ago. Beijing says the initiative aims to deepen friendly trade relations with other nations, specifically in developing countries. But critics have long accused China luring lower-income countries into debt traps by offering huge unaffordable loans. In comparison to the IMF and vast liquidity support extended by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Small but growing quickly. The report warned that Chinese loans tend to be more opaque and compared to other international lenders. And China's foreign ministry hit back at criticism on Tuesday, accusing people of hyping up so-called Chinese debt traps and opaque loans and slinging mud at China, something they do not accept. Since 2019, a joint team of Iraqi and French restoration experts support local efforts to give a new life of Assyrian pieces over 2,700 years in Iraq, which fragments were found in the museum after the city's liberation in 2017. Here's the story.
One fragment at a time, a French and Iraqi restoration team is trying to piece together antiquities smashed to pieces by Daesh group when they looted and ransacked Mosul's museum. In a video released early 2015, Daesh had filmed themselves smashing with sledgehammers some of the building's contents, including priceless statues, as part of their highly publicized campaign to erase any cultural history. Since 2019, a team of French restoration experts support local efforts to give a new life to Assyrian pieces of over 2,700 years, which fragments were found in the museum after the city's liberation in 2017. According to restoration expert Daniel Iblet, the biggest challenge the team faced was the sheer amount of fragments that needed to be sorted at the onset of their mission. The project receives funding from the International Alliance for Protection of Cultural Heritage in Conflict Areas. International partners of the project are the French Louvre Museum, the Washington Smithsonian Institution, and the World Monuments Fund.
In sports, Tottenham Hotspur have parted ways with manager Antonio Conte, the Premier League club said on Sunday, 8 days after the Italian's furious outburst following a draw at Southampton in the Premier League when his side threw away a 2-goal lead. The result meant Spurs stayed fourth in the table, but they are only 2 points above Newcastle, who have 2 games in hand. After a 3-3 draw, Conte, whose contract was due to expire in June, delivered a scathing verbal attack on his players, accusing them of being selfish. While still in contention for a top 4 finish, Tottenham bowed out of the Champions League last 16 to AC Milan this month and went out of the FA Cup to second-tier Sheffield United. Conte was appointed in November 2021 following the sacking of Nuno Espirito Santo. Luka Doncic finished with 25 points, 7 rebounds and 6 assists just hours after his most recent technical foul and 1-game suspension were rescinded Monday by the NBA and led the Dallas Mavericks past the Indiana Pacers 127-104. The Mavericks snapped a 4-game losing streak and remained in contention in the race for one of the final 2 play-in spots in Western Conference. Kyrie Irving added 16 points and 6 assists for Dallas. Indiana, led by Benedict Martin, scored 22 points and Andrew Nembhard 17, 5 rebounds and 5 assists. The Pacers were missing the starters and a key backup. The Pacers have lost 3 straight and 6/8 as they move closer to locking up a lottery pick. Finally, third-ranked Stefano Tsitsipas beat Chilean qualifier Christian Garin 6-3, 4-6, 6-4 at the Miami Open. On Monday, the week's first on-court action after a bye walkover. The world number 3 finally got to the Miami Open campaign underway on Monday. And Christian Garin, while Argentine Francesco Corraldo upset 5th seed Felix Aguirre-Alassiem. There was no shortage of Hard Rock Stadium, with American Frances Tiafoe beaten by 59th ranked Lorenzo Sonjo. France's Adrian Manorano beat 7th seed Paul Hubbard. And American qualifier Christer Ubix defeated Georgia Berari in a straight set. And Tsitsipas was not in court in a week. And moving to the rest, however, the Miami Open with Karen Khachanov breaking a 4-4 in the third set, making progress with the Chilean. Khachanov defeated the Czech Jiří Lecet 6-2, 6-4, reaching the Miami last 16 for the first time. Well, this brings us to the end of this edition of Nile TV Newsroom Live, but stay tuned for more here on Nile TV.